He humiliated a woman and her young daughter right there in the cafe. People remained silent, filming with their phones, and it seemed that no one would come to their aid. But he didn't know who would walk in at that moment. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The morning in the little roadside diner began the way it always did, with the hiss of the coffee machines, the clatter of plates, and the low murmur of conversations between regulars who had long ago grown accustomed to seeing the same faces at the same tables. The walls smelled faintly of bacon grease that no scrubbing ever removed, and the air was thick with a mixture of fried potatoes, butter, and a trace of maple syrup. The windows let in a pale slant of sunlight, not yet strong enough to warm the room, but enough to illuminate the streaks of steam rising from plates of eggs and toast. To outsiders, it might have looked like a scene from a painting of small-town America honest workmen in their overalls, farmers with weather-beaten hands wrapped around mugs of black coffee, older couples who knew the waitresses by name. At a corner table sat Sarah Miller, a 30-year-old nurse who had come off a long night shift and was still carrying the fatigue of endless hours under fluorescent lights, where she had tended to patients too frail to fend for themselves. Her body longed for rest, but she had promised her daughter a special breakfast. After school, drop-offs became routine. She wanted 5-year-old Emily to have moments of joy tucked into ordinary days, little memories that might outshine the exhaustion that sometimes clouded their household. Sarah had brushed her hair neatly, tied it back, and worn a simple blouse with a clean skirt, determined to look presentable even if her eyes betrayed her sleepless night. She sat upright, shoulders slightly tense, yet her hands moved carefully, cutting pancakes into small, manageable pieces for her daughter. Emily, with her hair in 2 uneven braids, was oblivious to the undercurrents of her mother's fatigue. To her, the world was syrup dripping from pancakes, the rainbow sheen of orange juice in a glass catching the sun, the warmth of her mother's presence across the table. She swung her legs beneath the chair, humming quietly to herself as she tried to balance a forkful of food without spilling it. For her, the diner was a safe place, filled with clinking dishes, friendly faces behind the counter, and the comfort of routine. The rhythm of the room shifted when the door creaked open, and Richard Hunt stepped inside. He carried himself with the air of someone who believed every space belonged to him the moment he entered it. At 45, with broad shoulders, a heavy-set frame, and a voice that carried too easily, he was well known in the town. He had built houses, bullied city council members into favorable deals, and made enough money to dress better than most men in the diner. He was wearing a crisp jacket, boots that gleamed unnaturally clean for the early hour, and a watch that flashed when it caught the light. He didn't so much take a seat as claim it, sprawling into a booth with a careless authority. People greeted him half-heartedly. A few nodded, some muttered his name, but no one truly welcomed him. Still, he acted as if he were among admirers, chuckling too loudly at his own jokes and gesturing broadly while speaking to no one in particular. His gaze roamed the room, cataloging every detail, and it eventually landed on Sarah and Emily. Something in their quiet dignity irritated him, though he could not have explained why. Perhaps it was the sight of a tired young mother trying to carve out a moment of peace, or the innocence of a child unaware of the power games that adults played. Whatever the reason, Richard decided they would be his target. It began subtly. He leaned back in his booth and made remarks that could have been about anyone, but each word was directed like a dart. He spoke of people who did not know their place, of those who thought they could sit wherever they pleased without earning it, of mothers who lived off scraps while pretending to teach their children pride. His voice carried, and though he did not use names, there was no mistaking who he meant. Forks paused mid-air, mugs hovered before lips, but no one said a word. The silence of the room was a tacit permission. Sarah's shoulders stiffened. She kept her eyes on Emily's plate, pretending not to hear. Years of tending to hostile patients had taught her how to keep her expression neutral, how to deflect cruelty by refusing to react. Yet she felt every word sink into her skin like a needle. She glanced around the room, saw the furtive eyes quickly drop, the subtle shift of bodies avoiding responsibility. She knew this pattern, the aggressor growing bolder because the audience chose silence. Richard pushed further. He tapped his spoon against his mug, louder and louder, until heads turned, and then he laughed in Sarah's direction. He said something about people who thought they belonged in decent establishments when they ought to know better, about mothers who filled their children's heads with lies about dignity when all they taught them was how to scrape for crumbs. His words were soaked with venom disguised as humor, and the laughter he expected from others never came. But he didn't stop. Finally, he rose, boots striking the floor with heavy confidence, and crossed the diner. The sound of his steps was enough to freeze the air. He stopped at Sarah's table and placed his hands firmly on the edge, leaning close enough that the plates rattled. The orange juice glass tipped and spilled, spreading sticky liquid across the table and dripping onto Emily's lap. The child let out a small cry, startled and frightened, and clutched her mother's arm. Sarah instinctively wrapped her arm around her daughter, shielding her, even as she stood to gather their things. She thought if she could just leave quietly, the scene would dissolve. But Richard moved deliberately into her path, positioning his body between her and the door. His smile was not kind. It was the smile of someone who enjoyed watching another person trapped. He towered over her, his shadow stretching across the floor, and his voice grew louder. He demanded that she acknowledge she had no right to sit where she was sitting, that people like her made others uncomfortable, that she should take her child and leave before he made her. Every word landed with the force of humiliation, not just for Sarah, but for Emily, who pressed her face against her mother's side, sensing the threat without fully understanding it. Sarah felt a surge of heat in her chest, anger mingling with fear, but she was alone in that moment. Around her, the diner's patrons watched in silence, some raising their phones to record, others pretending to be absorbed in their meals. Their passivity was worse than Richard's cruelty, for it stripped her of the belief that anyone would intervene. She lifted her chin, though her heart pounded. She tried to edge sideways, but Richard mirrored her movements, blocking her each time. His breathing was heavier now, intoxicated by the power of the moment, by the knowledge that all eyes were on him and no one dared oppose him. The longer the silence stretched, the more emboldened he became. He leaned closer, his voice rising, his words cutting deeper, until Sarah felt the sting of shame on her skin. The diner's atmosphere, once filled with ordinary chatter, was now thick with tension, as if the very walls held their breath. Outside, the morning sun brightened the street, but inside, the light seemed dimmer, clouded by the ugliness of what was unfolding. Sarah held Emily close, her mind racing. She wanted to protect her daughter, to preserve her innocence, but she also felt the crushing weight of helplessness. She thought of her husband, of the promise of safety he represented, but he wasn't there, at least not yet. Richard smirked as he realized he had reduced the room to silence and his victim to stillness. The spilled juice dripped steadily onto the floor, each drop a cruel metronome, marking the seconds of her humiliation. Sarah's back was to the wall, her daughter trembling against her, and the only thing left to do was endure until some unseen force shifted the balance. She did not know when or how, but she sensed that this moment, captured by so many phones, would not remain within these four walls. And though Richard believed he had complete control, though he reveled in the sight of Sarah cornered and Emily in tears, He was blind to the inevitability of interruption. For humiliation, once exposed, has a way of summoning reckoning, and Sarah, weary and trembling though she was, stood on the edge of that turning point. The chapter of humiliation was still unfolding, but the tide was already preparing to shift, carried by forces Richard could not see, and by footsteps that would soon cross the threshold to alter everything. The sound of juice dripping from the edge of the table to the floor seemed to stretch endlessly, each drop like a reminder of how low the moment had fallen. Sarah stood with her daughter pressed close to her side, her body tense, her mind running in circles of panic and frustration. Around her, the room remained cloaked in silence, a suffocating quiet that was not born of peace, but of fear, complicity, and the unwillingness of ordinary people to act when action carried a cost. Richard Hunt loomed over her, a man swollen with his own sense of dominance, his face flushed with the intoxication of power, his eyes gleaming with the cruel satisfaction of seeing a young mother and her child trapped. He shifted his weight deliberately, blocking every subtle movement she attempted toward the door, his voice rising into harsher tones, demanding acknowledgement, demanding surrender, demanding humiliation that would lodge itself deep within her heart and her daughter's memory. Emily's small sobs, muffled against her mother's blouse, were the only sound that dared to puncture the silence. They cut sharper than any insult, a reminder that this moment wasn't only an assault on Sarah, but on the innocence of a child who did not yet understand why a stranger's anger had turned into such cruelty. Sarah's hand smoothed the little girl's hair automatically, even as her own body trembled, her instinct to protect overriding her despair. She could feel the stares of the other diners burn into her skin, but they were empty stares, neither friend nor shield, only witnesses waiting for the spectacle to end one way or another. And then the door opened. It was such a simple sound, the creak of hinges and the rush of cooler morning air into the warmth of the diner, but it shifted the weight of the room. Mark Miller stepped inside, a man of 40, broad-shouldered from years of labor in the garage where he repaired cars, his hands permanently roughened by tools and grease, his clothes smelling faintly of oil and metal. He carried no air of authority beyond the kind earned by honest work and quiet reliability. Yet the moment his eyes took in the scene before him, the spilled juice on the floor, the trembling child pressed into Sarah's side, and Richard standing over them, something settled over the room that no one could quite define. Sarah lifted her head and met her husband's eyes. In them she saw no panic, no confusion, only recognition and steady resolve. For weeks, she had borne small humiliations in silence, the little dismissals, the sharp words in grocery aisles, the lingering stares that tried to shrink her existence. She had endured, thinking she could shoulder it alone, but now here was the man who had promised to stand beside her in all things, and in that instant, she felt both exposed and saved. Mark's stride was not hurried, yet it was purposeful. Each step toward the table seemed to diminish Richard's imposing frame. He moved not with aggression, but with inevitability, as though he had been walking this path all along. The scrape of his boots against the diner's floor filled the silence more fully than Richard's shouting ever had. Conversations that had frozen into stillness resumed not with words, but with the shuffle of chairs as people angled their phones, as they leaned forward to catch what they instinctively knew would be the turning point. He came to stand beside Sarah and Emily, his presence a shield more powerful than any wall. He placed one hand lightly against Sarah's back, steadying her, and the other hovered protectively near his daughter's shoulder. He did not need to raise his voice. His silence, his posture, his refusal to back away spoke louder than any threat. Richard, still flushed with the momentum of his tirade, opened his mouth to continue, but the words faltered. For the first time, his opponent was not a weary mother or a frightened child, but a man rooted in quiet strength, and the balance of the room shifted. The diners sensed it. The tension that had been one-sided now stretched in the opposite direction. Where before Richard had fed on the silence of the crowd, he now faced their anticipation, their readiness to see him confronted. Phones rose higher, recording not just the cruelty of a bully, but the arrival of its counterweight. People who had averted their eyes earlier now locked their gazes on Mark, as though investing their silent hopes in him. Sarah breathed more steadily. Her fear had not vanished, but the crushing sense of isolation eased. Emily peeked from behind her mother's side, her wet cheeks glistening, her small body trembling less as she looked at her father. The sight of him, ordinary yet immovable, planted the first seed of safety in her. Richard tried to maintain his performance. He straightened his back, puffed out his chest, and spoke louder, his voice cracking on words that only minutes earlier had dripped with certainty. He gestured with his hands, jabbing the air toward Mark, as though volume and motion could disguise the tremor at their edges. He laughed too harshly, too quickly, a brittle sound that convinced no one. The cruel smile twisted into something more strained, more desperate, as if he felt the ground beneath him tilting. Mark still did not raise his voice. He simply remained there, between his family and the man who threatened them, his eyes steady, his shoulders squared. The contrast was undeniable. Richard's bluster against Mark's calm created a scene that needed no words. In every recording phone, in every watching eye, the truth was plain. One man craved domination, the other embodied protection. The waitress, who had frozen behind the counter, finally moved. Her hands shook as she dialed the police, her voice low and urgent, yet the sound carried across the room like a lifeline. The knowledge that law enforcement was on its way heightened the stakes, and Richard, sensing his window to control the narrative closing, grew more erratic. He leaned closer, his words tumbling over themselves, spitting accusations that Sarah had provoked him, that people like her disrespected the town, that he was defending tradition. But the words fell flat, even to his own ears. Mark did not respond, not with words, not with gestures. He stood as a living rebuttal, his very presence dissolving Richard's authority. Each second that passed made Richard's movements more frantic, and the calm of Sarah and Emily behind Mark more dignified. The imbalance of power reversed itself completely. Where once Sarah had been pinned, now Richard seemed the one cornered, hemmed in by cameras, witnesses, and the quiet certainty of a man who would not allow his family to be humiliated again. Outside, sirens began to wail faintly, still distant, but drawing nearer, their promise weaving into the fabric of the diner's silence. Richard heard them too, and his eyes darted toward the windows. The bravado that had carried him faltered, replaced by the first flickers of panic. The performance was ending, and the audience he had craved was no longer his to command. Sarah felt Emily's small hand clutch more tightly at her skirt, but when she looked down at her daughter, she saw something different in her eyes. The tears were still there, the fear too, but also a spark of wonder as she gazed at her father. For Emily, this moment would etch itself deep, not only as a memory of fear, but as the first clear image of what it meant to be protected, to be valued, to be seen. The room held its breath as the sirens grew louder. Mark did not move, did not flinch, even as Richard's voice climbed into shrill notes. He simply remained the anchor in a storm, and that was enough. When the police finally pushed through the door, drawn by the waitress's trembling voice and the urgency of the moment, they walked into a scene already transformed. The confrontation was no longer about a man trying to humiliate a woman and her child. It had become about a community forced to see itself, about silence broken by presence, about the undeniable line between cruelty and dignity. The officers moved swiftly, guiding Richard away even as he sputtered excuses, but it was clear to everyone that his hold had already broken. Phones recorded his retreat, his hands raised, his words jumbled, while in the foreground, Sarah clutched Emily and stood at her husband's side. The balance had been restored, but the story was far from over. For though Richard was removed from the room, the echoes of his cruelty and the evidence captured on countless devices would ripple far beyond the walls of that small diner. And so, as the red and blue lights flashed through the windows, casting shifting colors across the weary faces of the diners, Sarah knew that humiliation had given way to confrontation, and confrontation was only the beginning. The day was not finished with them yet, nor was the town, nor the world that was already waiting beyond those diner walls. The flashing lights outside the diner cast long, restless shadows across the walls as officers guided Richard Hunt through the doorway, his voice still raised, though his words had lost all sharpness. The sound of his protests carried into the street, but inside the diner, the noise settled into an uneasy hush. Patrons shifted in their seats, phones lowered, though still clutched in hand, some glancing at one another as if to confirm that what they had just witnessed had indeed happened. Sarah stood with Emily pressed against her, the child's small hands clutching at her blouse, her damp cheeks buried in the safety of her mother's side. Mark remained close, a steady presence, his breathing controlled though the storm of the moment still lingered in his chest. The officers offered brief words of reassurance, asking for statements, but it was clear from the looks on their faces that the footage already circulating from every angle had captured more than enough. Outside, the hum of voices swelled as bystanders gathered, some curious, others concerned, many holding up their own phones to record Richard's walk of shame as he was escorted to the patrol car. He shouted something about misunderstandings, about being provoked, about his good name in the town, but the words dissolved into the cold morning air. No one clapped, no one defended him. The power he had wielded so easily minutes before had evaporated under the weight of exposure. The image of a grown man blocking a mother and child, towering over them with spit-flecked rage, was too vivid, too undeniable to be smoothed away by excuses. The officers returned inside to collect the statements they needed, but the diners themselves had already become witnesses. Phones buzzed with notifications as videos were uploaded, shared, and reposted. Within minutes, Sarah's humiliation and Mark's arrival had spread far beyond the small town's limits. People began to whisper, passing their screens from one table to another, the captions already appearing. Local bully harasses mother and child in diner. Husband steps in. Police arrive. Small town shame goes viral. The internet had seized on the story before the last plates of breakfast had cooled. For Sarah, the enormity of what had happened had not yet taken root. Her body still trembled with the echo of fear, the helplessness of standing alone with her daughter against a man who sought to strip them of their dignity. Yet when she looked at Mark, when she saw the steadiness in his jaw, the calm certainty with which he had placed himself between them and danger, she felt the first glimmer of something other than fear. It wasn't relief, not yet, but the sense that she had not been invisible. Emily, though still shaken, clung to both parents now, her small face lifted toward the flashing lights outside with wide eyes that seemed to absorb more than her young years could process. By afternoon, the story had grown legs. Local news stations picked it up, first reporting it as an altercation at a diner, but soon shifting their tone as the viral videos painted a clearer, darker picture. Comment sections exploded, some filled with outrage and calls for accountability, others dismissing the events as overblown, a clash taken out of context. Yet the images spoke louder than commentary. Richard's sneering face, Sarah's protective stance, Emily's tears, Mark's calm arrival, and finally the officer's intervention. Together, they formed a sequence that could not be untangled, a narrative that demanded judgment. In town, the consequences were immediate. Conversations in grocery store aisles, at gas stations, and across backyard fences circled back to the diner. For some, it was a reckoning long overdue. Richard Hunt had bullied his way through business deals and social gatherings for years, relying on his money and his bluster to silence those who opposed him. For others, it was an embarrassment, a stain on the town's reputation, an unwelcome intrusion of outside attention. But for Sarah and Mark, it was both more personal and more fragile. They had not sought to become symbols. They had only wanted a quiet breakfast, a normal morning, and yet they now found themselves thrust into a storm that would not dissipate quickly. That evening, their home felt different. Emily clung to Sarah longer than usual at bedtime, her questions hesitant, her small voice asking why the man had been so angry, why everyone had just watched. Sarah answered gently, speaking of kindness and cruelty, of how some people carried anger like a shadow, and of how important it was to stand together when shadows grew too long. Mark listened quietly, adding only that Emily was safe, and that she would always be safe when they stood as a family. When the child finally drifted into sleep, Sarah sat at the kitchen table, the day's weight pressing down on her. Mark placed a hand over hers, not with dramatic words, but with the steady pressure of someone who knew that presence meant more than speeches. By the following morning, the story had reached regional stations. A reporter appeared at the edge of their driveway, asking for a statement, holding a microphone like a weapon of curiosity. Sarah declined politely, shielding Emily from the cameras. Mark stood firm, telling the reporter that what mattered was already clear in the videos, that the rest would play out in court and in the conscience of the community. Yet the calls kept coming. The phone rang with friends offering support, with strangers sending messages of solidarity, with others demanding explanations or venting their anger at the exposure the town now faced. In the diner, business faltered. Regulars who had turned away in silence the morning before now faced their own reflection in the screens that showed their inaction. Some confessed guilt. Some justified themselves, but none could deny that they had witnessed cruelty and chosen stillness. The waitress who had called the police spoke quietly to a reporter, her words halting but firm, admitting that she should have intervened sooner, that it had taken too long for her to act. Her confession only deepened the sense of complicity hanging over the town. For Richard, the consequences mounted quickly. The footage spread faster than any attempt at spin, and his connections to the council and business community suddenly felt more like liabilities than assets. Those who had once shaken his hand at meetings now distanced themselves, issuing cautious statements about respect, fairness, and community values. His lawyer drafted responses, claiming provocation, misunderstanding, context omitted, but no phrasing could erase the image of his bulk blocking a young mother and her child. The evidence was too raw, too visceral to be diluted. Within days, the diner incident had become a case study far beyond the small town. Online discussions framed it as an example of everyday cruelty, of gendered and generational imbalance, of what happened when silence enabled bullies. Civil rights advocates cited it as part of a larger pattern. Parenting groups shared it as a warning of what children could be forced to witness. Veterans of small-town life shared stories of their own experiences, of the neighbors who had humiliated them in places that were supposed to be safe. Sarah and Mark's names circulated without their permission, becoming shorthand for resilience and dignity, even as they tried to keep their routines intact. But amid the noise, there was also clarity. For Sarah, the humiliation had been real and cutting, yet it had been followed by the unmistakable proof that she was not alone. For Mark, the confrontation had been instinctive, a simple act of standing where he was needed, yet it revealed to others what quiet strength could look like. For Emily, though her tears had marked the memory, there was also the lesson that her parents had faced cruelty together, unbroken. The town itself began to shift, subtly at first, then more openly. At church gatherings, in school board meetings, in late-night conversations at kitchen tables, people spoke of what they had seen. Some admitted their shame at staying silent. Others argued that it was none of their business. But the dialogue itself was a change. It forced a community that had long tolerated Richard's behavior to look at itself honestly. And though not everyone was ready to embrace accountability, enough were stirred by the sight of Sarah's trembling hand on her daughter's shoulder, of Mark's stillness in the face of rage, that a current of transformation began to flow. Months later, the viral storm had calmed, though the echoes remained. Richard faced charges that kept him entangled in courtrooms, his reputation stripped bare. The diner recovered slowly, under new management determined to restore trust. Sarah returned to her shifts at the clinic, her work unchanged, but her sense of self deepened by the knowledge that she had endured and stood through something larger than herself. Mark kept repairing cars, his days filled with the same grease and labor, but now people saw more when they looked at him. And Emily, who once cried over spilled juice, now carried the quiet memory of parents who had refused to bow before cruelty. The story did not end with the flashing lights or the viral videos. It continued in the subtle transformations of a town that could no longer pretend not to see, in the steady resilience of a family that had found its strength in unity, and in the lasting reminder that humiliation, once exposed, has the power to awaken dignity, not only in those who suffer it, but in those who witness it. For Sarah, Mark, and Emily, life moved forward with scars, but also with a stronger foundation proof that even in the smallest corners of the world, standing together could change the shape of the future. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch the next video waiting for you right now. There are many more stories worth discovering. And don't forget to share this video with friends and family. Some journeys are too meaningful to keep to yourself.